Thank you very much, Susan, and congratulations on organizing this conference. I think the level of interest shows how important a topic this is. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about thinking about data as a development issue. And while Susan built this as a preview to the WDR, I'd like to slightly recast that and mention that this is really more of a sharing of preliminary thinking and more of a consultation about how we're starting to approach the problem. So I'd like to talk about data as a development issue. When we talk about data, we're going to be thinking about a data value chain that spans creation and collection, storage, processing, sharing, securing access, using, archiving, etc. But I'd like you to notice something very important about the data value chain, which is that it's not so much a chain as a circle, meaning that data can be reused. And in fact, one of the most important economic characteristics of data is indeed that it's non-rivalrous in use. And so potentially we can use it again and again and potentially gain increasing economic value every time we use it. Although, of course, we may also want to destroy it. We may have legitimate reasons for destroying it at some point and breaking that cycle. So the WDR 2021 will be on the topic of data for development. It's scheduled for publication in exactly 1 year from today, more or less. And so, as I mentioned, we're here not so much to share results as to pose questions and hear from you about how you're thinking on these issues. There's been quite a burgeoning academic and policy literature on the topic of data in the last years and months. A lot of this literature looks at data governance questions from the perspective of OECD, or developed economies. And so the contribution we'd really like to make through the World Development Report is to bring the data discussion very much, see it through the lens of low and middle income countries. We know that there's a huge digital divide already. If we look at data consumption per capita, it's 7 times as high in Finland as it is in Peru. And before we get very excited about data for development, we need to think, what does it mean for a poor subsistence farmer in Nigeria operating in a barter economy? Does data really bring promise for someone living in that situation? Can data help poor people who may not even leave their own data trail to be analyzed and processed for policy responses? We think that throughout the World Development Report, it's going to be important to think about poor people and also poor countries. And so we're laying out a few of the characteristics of both that we think we need to inform our analysis. Poor people, whatever we come up with needs to be cognizant that we may be talking about populations with low digital literacy, low levels of education, low purchasing power, a high degree of informality, and indeed a relatively young population. Poor countries also have certain attributes which distinguish how they benefit from or participate in the data economy. The size, the small scale of most developing countries is important. We know that data is subject to massive scale economies. Everyone's talking about minimum efficient scale for artificial intelligence. So how does that affect countries that are really very small in economic terms and even smaller in terms of their data mass? We know, of course, that we're dealing with weak governance environments, and we know that regulating data poses very complex institutional challenges, so that approaches developed in the OECD may not necessarily carry over. We also know that we're in low productivity environments where companies may struggle to adopt innovation, as well as high risk for development of data infrastructure. So all of these characteristics of poor people and countries need to be in the center as we think about data as a development issue. When we start to look at sorry, this is not moving. Sorry, that's okay. So as we started to think about data, we found the need to differentiate between data for public purposes and data for private purposes. Traditionally, data, if we go back a few decades, data was largely a public sector undertaking. It was the domain of the National Statistical Agency. It was managed through processes like censuses and household surveys. Obviously, that data was mainly collected with a public good purpose in mind. It was designed to represent the entire population and to think about all kind of aspects of well-being. And it was used by human analysts using kind of inferential statistical techniques. That, of course, has changed dramatically in recent years. Data collected for private purposes by private actors, typically through mobile devices and sensors, and often simply as a byproduct of commercial transactions regarded as digital exhaust, is now the sort of by far the largest mass and the fastest growing mass of data that we have. This data is commercial in purpose. It's targeting a much narrower population. It may not be representative of the universe as a whole. And it's increasingly being used for prediction rather than inference by machine analysts rather than human ones. So two very different environments that we need to consider in parallel. We think that these two types of data have huge complementarities in terms of their timeliness. Public traditional data had long time lags. The new private data is frequently instantaneous. Frequency, continuous versus infrequent. Granularity, traditional data could at best give us averages for representative groups of the population. We're now talking about individualized, personalized data. So granularity much finer. And of course the collection, marginal cost close to zero, as opposed to quite heavy systems still required to collect public intent data. So we see inherent complementarities, and in particular we see the potential to repurpose private data for public good purposes. And we have a lot of good examples of that, whether it's the use of cell phone data to support natural disaster response, or using social media information to identify road traffic hotspots for accidents. And there are many, many applications that are coming to mind. So we see given the non-rivalrous nature of data, we see a lot of potential for doing that. We also see a great deal of potential for improving interoperability across public intent data, which is often contained in silos and therefore not yielding the full value for policymakers. If we think about data for development, we need to have some kind of theory of change. How does data actually support development? And we've identified three institutional channels through which data supports development. And first of all, I'd like to talk about positive linkages. I think through the government channel there on the top of the chart, it's the traditional thing about evidence-based policy making, better design policies, improved spending, targeting of spending, and better service delivery. On the middle channel, I think the previous speaker alluded to the importance of data as providing transparency and accountability, empowering civil society to hold both governments and firms accountable for the social good. And access to one's own information as an individual can also provide empowerment in terms of self-advocacy and access to services. Finally, the third channel there is data as the new factor of production. Data now contributes to development not only through these indirect governance or policy-making benefits, but directly as a source of economic value creation and indeed a growing basis for trade. However, as everyone knows, this is not the whole story. In addition to those positive linkages, we're also seeing increasing concern about negative linkages between data and development. There is a great deal of concern about the misuse of data by different parties, whether it's governments for political surveillance, institutionalized discrimination, or election rigging. Through the civil society channel, there's the whole area of criminal activity and cyber crime. And of course, on the private sector side, data can also be misused by private actors. There's a lot of concern about surveillance capitalism, about intrusive marketing, use of algorithms for behavior change, perfect price discrimination to fully extract profit, algorithmic collusion to tacitly abuse market power. So there are also many negative channels. So any discussion of data for development has to look at both sides of the equation and has to have a balanced consideration of both of these channels. So we think that critical to, if you like, navigating that trade-off between the benefits and risks is the importance of trust. The use of data is, in a sense, a transaction based on trust. I give you my data if I trust that you're going to use it for positive purposes. And so we think that safeguards are critical to creating that environment of trust in which data can actually be provided. And those safeguards are wide-ranging. I'd want to highlight, of course, the central issue of data protection and how it gives certain rights both to the provider of data and obligations on the user of data. There are issues around cybersecurity, algorithmic regulation, and so forth. There's a huge number of complex issues to be unpacked in this category. But also, if we want data to actually, once a trust environment is created, to actually flow and to be used among different applications, we also need enablers. We need a regulatory environment that facilitates the transfer of data and the use of data by different actors. And that hinges on characteristics like interoperability, portability, and of course, broad access to information. So unpacking this, understanding this, shedding light on trade-offs and synergies between these different aspects of the regulatory environment will be a central agenda item for the World Development Report. We also see that achieving a balanced movement from data to development poses many practical challenges. I've mentioned the legal and regulatory framework. I'd like to also mention three other challenges: infrastructure, economic policy, and institutions and governance. Clearly, in terms of infrastructure, there are challenges for developing countries to actually expand data infrastructure to sustain the exponential growth of data traffic. This is particularly challenging given that while traffic is growing exponentially, revenues of the operators that provide the infrastructure are actually declining due to increasing kind of free marginal cost usage channels. And therefore, there's a real issue around how that's financed. And increasingly, we're actually seeing content providers going into financing infrastructure provision in the developing world. We find that more than 100 developing countries lack the infrastructure they need to keep the internet running in the event of losing international connectivity. So, i.e., they're not internet self-sufficient or autonomous. And there are both economic and political questions around that, but let's just think first of the economic ones. To what extent does it make sense for countries to build their own infrastructure versus relying on international data centers, cloud computing, etc.? That's going to be a key question for us to address. In addition, we want to look at the enduring universal access challenges. In our view, these are now shifting more towards demand-side barriers with relatively high rates of coverage, close to universal coverage in most parts of the world, except perhaps for sub-Saharan Africa. But we see major demand-side barriers. Take South Africa, for instance. The broadband signals available to 99.5% of the population, only 60% are using the internet. So we need to think about affordability, handsets, pricing plans, digital literacy, and indeed relevance of local content. So a big set of challenges there. Turning to economic policy, we're seeing that the data-driven economy is posing policy challenges for competition agencies. There's grappling with the huge market power of the technology giants in the platform businesses. And these business models are challenging traditional antitrust tools and techniques. We're seeing huge challenges for tax authorities that are seeing a growing part of their economy going into the digital space with companies that can very easily move profits across borders and making it harder to collect direct taxes and even posing challenges for indirect taxation also. And finally, we're seeing a lot of challenges for trade negotiators and government policymakers who are trying to balance domestic concerns about data protection with not being protectionist in the international space where data is increasingly a tradable commodity or an enabler of electronic commerce in physical commodities. Finally, in terms of institutions and governance, we see that data is posing challenges for defining the right institutional ecosystem at the national level. Do we need new institutions to play some of these legal and regulatory roles around data protection? To what extent do we need to repurpose existing institutions, such as the national statistical agencies, in order to adapt them to the new environment? And then at the international level, there's a need to renegotiate important agreements around trade, around taxation, around data. And the question there is, what is the voice of small developing countries? How can their interests be safeguarded in these global negotiations? And how do we address cross-border spillovers in regulatory decisions taken in one jurisdiction that then may have global repercussions? So I hope I've given you a little bit of a flavor of how we're beginning to think about the WDR. As I mentioned, it's very early stages. I just want to leave up a few questions that we're grappling with. Maybe they will hopefully stimulate some thoughts from your side. So how do the data governance challenges differ between advanced and emerging economies? How can developing countries fully leverage data while managing the associated risks? What is the right balance between enablers and safeguards in the regulatory framework for data? And how does international data governance need to adapt to safeguard the interests of emerging economies? So look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
We're going to have some questions. So we want to open the floor from questions. Are there any questions from the web users? Okay, want to go first? Okay, sir. Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Safili, background in IT, telecom, and cybersecurity. Report 2021. Does it address hackers, terrorists? As of this morning, the UN network was compromised, vulnerability covered by hackers this morning. So what World Bank is doing with the report that you are going to present next year about terrorists and hackers?
Could we take like several questions? Would that be possible? I'm making a careful
Other questions? I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. To what extent are you able to use the internet to hold meetings online and gather funding for projects and get the local interests expressing what they need in the projects?
Any other questions? Yes, Shida.
Thank you. This has been an excellent presentation. I was wondering, I think there is a crisis that we have on the use of data and the literacy, statistical or data literacy. And I was wondering where in this beautiful framework do you have, how we can sort of make that enabler rather than a risk that we are managing right now. Thank you.
You want some more? Anyone else want to ask a question? Please.
Thanks, Vivien. This was a great talk. As you're thinking through answering these questions, maybe you need to answer these before you can answer the one about the poses. Where do you think about the bank's responsibilities in terms of its programmatic activities versus how it's dealing with its client countries? Is this something you're going to address? How you treat data internally and thinking about governance internally versus how you're engaging with client countries and how they use data?
Great, well, thanks very much. Yes, cybersecurity hackers definitely very much on the agenda for this report. We know that the risks will only get greater as we move towards 5G technology, which is very much on the horizon. Much more will be at stake with the ability to remotely control all kinds of devices, many of them life-threatening potentially. So yes, that's definitely going to be an important component of the report, as it is an important component of our dialogue and engagement with our client countries on all of our digital operations. And yes, we do use a lot of online conferences, but we do as well have a very big presence on the ground, which we still feel is very important, and the institution is decentralizing, as you may know, quite considerably in recent years. On the issue of data literacy or the skills, the human side, thank you for raising that. I perhaps omitted to mention it, but we think it's very important, both for the users as a barrier to actually adoption and the ability of individuals to benefit from the data-driven economy, but also the shortage of skills in terms of professionals who are able to develop, maintain these infrastructures and indeed develop the applications that are relevant is also a huge issue. So we will be having a significant component looking at that aspect. So yes, I'm not sure if I can go into great detail on that final point, except to say that yes, we're aware that there is an internal agenda around data as well as the agenda when we engage with our client countries. I think we will want to cover both of these aspects in the report, and we certainly plan to do so. That's probably all I can say on that one at the moment.
Do you have time for some more questions?
Depends on if there's interest, yeah.
Who has the mic?
Hello, thank you for your presentation. My name is Audrey Vilanovich with USAID Data Services. I wanted to know about the World Bank's thoughts on the standardization of presentation of data for the ease of consumption and use and analysis. Thank you.
Sunil Sharma from the Institute of International Economic Policy. One issue as we sort of move towards a digital economy, and in some sense data becomes a fundamental resource, there has to arise the issue of redundancy. Right? So if I have only one place where data is stored, and increasingly the system is dependent on this source for the functioning of private institutions, public institutions, so on and so forth, we have to have backups. Right? So the whole issue of redundancy becomes important because it's fundamental to trying to understand the systemic risk that we're creating. Right? Because if this network, which is domestic as well as interlinked internationally, if you think about what happened during the financial crisis, if it breaks down, in a sense, we are pushing risks to the tail, then we have to deal with tail risks by redundancy or other measures. So is there any discussion in terms of the safety of the system as a whole?
Any other questions? Oh, yes, sir.
James, retired. A taxonomy question. What's the distinction between emerging and developing countries? The obvious one, of course, is China always calls itself a developing country, but doesn't seem to quite fit as in emerging problems. And India also, which is clearly still poor, but has fairly substantial, a different set of digital infrastructure problems than I think some of the other ones.
Any other questions? Please, two more over there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Some of the
Rachel, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Rachel Pfeffer from CRS, Congressional Research Service. Some of the greatest mobile entrepreneurship stories have come out of developing countries, like you think about M-Pesa from Kenya and such. So are you going to touch on how developing countries or emerging markets, however you want to call them, can leverage public data to try to drive data usage and entrepreneurship within their local economies and in emerging markets?
Why don't we stop with that?
Good. So standardization of data, I think, was the first question. So and that question can be taken at a number of levels. I think from our perspective at the World Bank, part of what we're doing is supporting international harmonization of statistics to allow comparability across countries. I think that's an important function in the statistical system. But standardization equally applies to issues of interoperability. Can databases of a particular government, are they designed in a consistent way? Do they have consistent compatible software and so forth, and can they actually interact? So I think standardization or interoperability is a sort of pervasive theme that we will need to negotiate. And certainly redundancy of infrastructure is important. Clearly, when data is being stored on behalf of third parties, the question of risk is very, very critical, and finding the right level of kind of security is something that has to be considered in terms of the economic balance of risk and cost. I think on the mobile entrepreneurship, yes, we will definitely be looking at the business opportunities that data represents for the developing world, and there's a rich array of examples. Alongside the technology giants that we're all familiar with, there are a lot of developing country success stories in the platform business as well, whether it's Mercado Libre in Latin America or Grab in Indonesia, Alibaba in China. So there's definitely a lot of interesting stories to be told. I think one of the key questions is the competition between the global players and some of the local players in developing countries, and how that is going to pan out. So I think, yeah, those were the main points.
Can you stay for a few more questions? Okay, we have an online question, which I cannot read. Can you read it?
This is a question from Jess Ya. Are you able to speak to data as an emerging tool in migration governance? Is WBG cooperating with IOM, UNHCR? How is data being used in the World Bank's refugee windows?
Any other questions? Oh, yes. Can you stay for a few more minutes? Okay, great. Oh, yes.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question about the way in which data is supported and financed by external donors for low and middle income countries. So the excitement around the digital economy drives an excitement around innovation, digital solutions, all of the shiny new stuff that everyone's excited about. But there's a balance, of course, you started and Dr. Foster started with the kind of core statistical building blocks or the core data capacities of a government that enables them to manage the data ecosystem, that enables them to take advantage of new technologies and the capacities to manage some of these governance challenges. So I'm wondering how in the WDR you're thinking about the way in which external and domestic financing incentivizes the development of the pieces that allow countries to kind of take advantage of the benefits and address some of the safeguards issues. Thanks.
We have a question here.
Thanks. I'm John Zoltner from Save the Children. It's easy to see how relatively wealthy people in rich countries generate a lot of data because private industry comes in and creates tools like Amazon.com or puts on content that's available to research purchasing cars and things like that. But low-income people in poor countries, I guess in aggregate, they may be important to private industry. If there's a fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, then it would make sense to track purchase data and try to sell, single load washing machine pods for doing the wash. But the individual would be worth very little to a company. So how can you kind of promote the creation of data that can be worthwhile since private industry usually drives the creation of government services also?
We have one more question here. Is this too many? We can
Maybe
regroup.
one more.
Okay.
Good morning. I'm Agnieszka Rawa. I'm with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Thank you for this great presentation. Question that I had is, to what extent are there, some individuals have compared data to the new oil. There are, some challenges and differences with that comparison, but notwithstanding, to what extent in this process are you leveraging the decade-long experience and also the IFC's experience in sort of managing the dialogue between the private sector, extractive sectors, and sort of the regulatory framework? Because you could think of creating ways of managing the concessions to that resource, and how do you safeguard that? So I guess I'm just wondering, how do you pick both the positive and the not so good examples that have led in a sense even to greater inequities in some countries? How do we build on the good for that purpose?
Why don't we stop it there for right now, and then we can have some more.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think data as a new oil is, as you say, it's a puzzling analogy. I mean, on the one hand, it's true that data is fueling the new economy, but the sort of the analogy kind of stops there, because oil is an exhaustible resource and data is as we said, a non-rivalrous resource. So that's already a major difference in terms of economically how they function. So yes, I mean, just to emphasize that this WDR is very much looking at the private sector side as well as the public sector side. We are working closely with the IFC on the key areas of interest, and so I think we will be able to definitely bring in the advantage of that expertise. Turning to the question about rich people generate lots of data, there's very little data about poor people. I think this is a really central question that we're grappling with, and I think it's very important to this WDR. While I could certainly agree with you that there's perhaps less, financial or commercial potential in poor people's data that may stimulate less engagement, at the same time, we're also seeing that one of the key characteristics of the data economy and data transactions is very, very low transaction cost. And that's actually helping smaller players to come in through platforms in ways that may never have been possible before, to get things like credit scores and access to finance, or SMEs to participate in e-commerce. So I don't want to oversell that either, but I think one has to look at both sides of that equation. I think it also speaks to the issue of ensuring that developing countries have their own kind of vibrant data-driven sector, that it can address their own kind of domestic concerns and specific needs, which comes back to the competition policy issues as well. So I share your concern, and we're definitely going to be grappling with that question. There was a question about the national statistical agencies and the finance of donors. This is obviously very critical, and the bank has been engaged for many years in statistical capacity building programs and in providing grants to statistical capacity agencies. We remain very concerned about the low levels of statistical capacity. I think Dr. Foster mentioned the statistical capacity index, which we will be bringing out in the WDR to emphasize that. If anything, the lack of statistical capacity is more worrying now than it's ever been, just simply because these challenges are becoming increasingly central economically and complex institutionally. So that will definitely be something that we need to focus on. Some countries are actually repurposing their national statistical agencies to be quasi-data regulators or data curators of various kinds. So one could envisage a whole new role for statistical agencies, but if they're struggling to fulfill their historic role, how are they going to rise to these new challenges? So that's definitely a central concern. Then on migration governance, I think all I would say there is that, really the use of data, big data and data-driven techniques has really become mainstreamed across the bank's engagement on a wide variety of development issues. So while I'm not personally familiar with the specifics, I'm sure that this is something that's definitely being used. So I'll stop there.
Do you have time for a couple more, or would you? Do you need to?
You're cool. You're cool.
No, we'd love to have you. Yes.
You're a good sport, Vivien.
Here all day.
Last batch.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Risha Rumi from the Ford Foundation. Would love to hear your thoughts on the role, on the entrance points for civil society to help shape the data governance conversation, particularly in a moment innovation is trailing policy and the private sector is advancing business models that are extractive and advocating for self-regulation.
Do you have an online question?
Ilana Harris from AAAS. One words that we didn't hear in your presentation is human rights. Could you address the questions or the challenges of providing developing countries which have, in general, poor human rights record with basically an extra efficient way of monitoring or their population?
Yeah, my name is Abdel Fattah from Ghana. A very good presentation. In your presentation, you highlighted some negative linkages of data to development. And I want to find out if World Bank is have any global rules or thinking about having one that will kind of regulate cross-border access and use of data, just to probably enable countries to freely be willing to share data for global security and other benefits, that will enhance development.
We have an online question.
Sorry. Oh, well, okay. I was going to grab one back.
Okay.
Thanks. Paul Nelson from the Center for Digital Development at USAID. Two questions. One, will the WDR report preview how the World Bank might change its investment portfolio based on the implications of data? So more of an institutional question. And then from a market level standpoint, could you go into a little bit more depth on how you're thinking about market concentration issues as it relates to the use of data, availability of data, and how it can potentially be an accelerant of market power in large institutions that can impair potentially innovation and a sense of empowerment in developing countries?
All right, we're going to have one more question, which is online, Vivien.
Okay.
What strategies are you thinking to protect the biases that machine learning algorithms can generate in data with a high level of sensitivity like these?
Okay, very good. Let's start at the end, so to speak. So on the biases of algorithms, yes, that's one of the key issues that we see under the safeguards bucket that I put up earlier. We think that it's important that regulators develop tools for addressing this. It's obviously a very challenging area because algorithms are not very transparent. And so there needs to be a new approach to actually testing algorithms, trying to understand, what are the actual implications of them. One of the challenges also is that they may be changing in real time as they continuously optimize with new sources of information. So we think it's a very critical issue, and it's definitely something that we want to address in the report. So on the market concentration issues, so I think there are many concerns because we know that there's huge network externalities and this whole market dominance dynamic. So because of the externalities of platforms and networks, once a company reaches a certain scale, it's almost impossible to compete with them because you want to be able to connect with the other people on the platform. This is a huge challenge because traditional antitrust is often focused on looking at price markups as evidence of manipulation, and in these markets, at least on the consumer side, the goods are provided for free. So it makes it very difficult to apply traditional remedies. Also, the markets are moving very rapidly, so these kind of very slow processes of responding to cases may actually just be far too unwieldy to really have an impact. We're also concerned about so-called killer acquisitions. So there's a lot of large tech firms are buying up very promising data-driven businesses in the developing world, which for an antitrust don't look like a problem because these startups are so small that they don't actually really change market power. But these may be the companies that could eventually challenge or provide a more differentiated or tailored kind of local service. So we think that's very important. In terms of the investment portfolio impact, I think the WDR really it's addressing the bank, but it's more addressing the world, and the bank is inside, if you like. So we will be talking generally about the responsibilities of international organizations, and I think once the WDR is out, we'll want to reflect specifically on what it means for the bank. But the document itself is not directed, as it were, solely internally, on the contrary. Ghana and the negative linkages and the cross-border access to data. So there's a big debate going on now about data localization. So a lot of developing countries are feeling that in order to sort of protect or to keep hold of that economic value that's contained in their data, that they need to sort of put down frontiers around it through data localization. There are physical aspects to that in terms of infrastructure. There are regulatory aspects to that. We want to look at that issue very closely. We want to understand what are the trade-offs involved. I mentioned early on that in the data-driven economy, scale is very fundamental. And so it's one thing for China to kind of firewall its internet because it's so large inside that it can still do many things. If a very small low-income country does the same thing, they may be preventing the economies of scale that are needed for data-driven economic opportunities to flourish. So it's a complex issue. There are economic aspects, there are political and security aspects, and we definitely want to go into that in some depth in the report. Human rights, absolutely, and thank you for bringing up the term explicitly. I think it surfaces in a couple of places. First of all, in the safeguards, particularly for personally identifiable information, the safeguards are very much coming out of a human rights framework and a human rights understanding of data issues. And therefore, we think that where data is personally identifiable, then we can't simply apply an economic trade-off type of thing. We have to protect the rights first, and then build the best enablers that we can while safeguarding the rights. So that's going to be a focus. In terms of the kind of abuse of data, I mentioned in the negative linkages slide that that's something that we're very much concerned about and that we will need to address in the report. And finally, I think there was a comment about the role of CSOs in data governance. Very much support that, and we are thinking of our governance chapter as a multi-stakeholder governance view, and we do see important roles for civil society and indeed for all parties in creating the right ecosystem for a balanced framework between data safeguards and data enablers. Thank you.